My name is Eliza May Sutton, and I've lived 87 years. Some folks might say a long life is a blessing from the Lord, but I've come to learn that time ain't always a gift. Sometimes, it's just a long, slow road you walk carrying a weight that don't belong to you. I was born right here in Hollow Creek, West Virginia, and I reckon I'll die here too. This town is tucked away in the hills, like a secret nobody cared to keep. The world rushed on by, but it never bothered to climb our dirt roads or quiet the whisper of the wind through the pines. Even now, when I sit on this old porch, the only sounds are the screen door groaning on its hinges and the lonely toll of the chapel bell marking time that only seems to matter around here. I live in the house my mother left me, a place where the walls hold more silence than memories. The paint is peeling something fierce, and the roof sings a mournful song when the rain comes, but it's the only home I've ever known. From this porch, I can smell the damp earth after a storm and the wood smoke from my neighbor's chimney. It's a small town, the kind where everybody knows your name, your people, and the stories they think they know about you. The weight of their gazes can feel heavier than a winter blanket, even when you're all alone. They see an old woman, quiet and kept to herself, a bit of a fixture like the old oak tree in the town square. They see the hands, gnarled and stained from a lifetime of work in the soil and wringing out sorrows. They see what they want to see. But there's a story behind these tired eyes that they never dared to ask about. A truth I've held in my throat for so long, it feels like a fishbone, stuck right where the words are meant to come out. It's a story about how the real monsters ain't the ones that hide in the dark. They're the ones who sit in the front pew on Sunday, smiling and shaking the preacher's hand. The ones whose names are spoken with respect while they build a private hell inside the four walls of a home. I've learned that a secret, especially a rotten one, doesn't die. It just seeps into the ground, poisoning everything that tries to grow. And after 87 years, I'm tired of tending a poisoned garden. I'm speaking now because the silence is finally heavier than the truth. I need to pull this weed up by the roots, no matter what comes down with it. If you're listening, if you've ever felt the chill of a secret you were forced to keep, then maybe you'll understand. If you like the beginning of this story, like, share, and subscribe to find out what I've been hiding for so long. The monster in my story had a name, and it was a name the whole of Hollow Creek respected. Jedediah Cartwright. To everyone who walked down Main Street, he was a pillar of this town, as sturdy and dependable as the stone walls of the chapel he helped build. He owned Cartwright's General Mercantile, the place where you'd get your flour, your nails, your news. On Sundays, he'd sit in the very first pew, his big, calloused hand resting on a leather-bound Bible, my mother, Willa, a quiet shadow by his side. Folks would tip their hats. "Mornin', Mr. Cartwright." A fine sermon, wasn't it, Jedediah? They listened to him. They looked up to him, and in their own way they feared him. His word was law, not just in our town, but within the four walls of our home. But the man they all saw, the decent church-going family man, he didn't live with us. The creature that shared our roof was something else entirely. He wasn't a father. He was an owner. He owned the chairs we sat on, the hours we kept, the very air we breathed, and eventually, he decided he owned me too. I was only 12, still more child than anything else, a skinny thing with scraped knees and a mind full of dandelion wishes. My body had just begun whispering about the woman I was supposed to become one day. Changes I didn't rightly understand. There was no warning. No single moment of dread before it happened. It was just an ordinary Tuesday, the air thick with the smell of my mother's baking. He came into my room with the scent of tobacco and cheap whiskey clinging to him like a second skin, and he shut the door. The look in his eyes was one I'd never seen before, a flat, hungry look that made the air go thin. With a quiet that was more terrifying than any shout, he stole what wasn't his to take. He turned me into a woman without my permission, without my understanding. He broke something inside me that day, something so deep that I didn't even know it had a name. When it was over, the silence that fell was louder than any scream. He just stood up, straightened his shirt as if he'd just been setting down a heavy box, and walked out, leaving me to drown in the quiet. And my mother, Willa, she knew. In a house as small as ours, with walls as thin as secrets, there's no hiding a sin that big. She must have heard, but she never said a word. She just kept on with her chores, her hands moving with a purpose my own body had forgotten how to have. The next morning, she wouldn't look at me. She just kept her eyes on the floor, on the dough she was kneadin', on anything but the daughter who had a ghost living behind her eyes. That night she left a tin cup of bitter-smelling tea by my bedside. She stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the hall light, and her voice was barely a whisper when she said it. "Don't you say a word, Eliza. You hear me? God sees everything." That sentence has haunted me my whole life. It echoed in my head for years, a constant, terrible reminder. If God saw everything, why was he so quiet? If he saw that little girl bleeding in a bed that wasn't safe anymore, why didn't he send a flood? Why didn't he strike that man down with a bolt of lightning? But God stayed silent, just like my mother, just like the whole world, it seemed. I was alone in that house with my shame, and I learned the hardest lesson a child can learn. That the people who are supposed to protect you are sometimes the very monsters you need protection from. And the silence, I came to find, was a poison all its own. It didn't just hide the truth, it helped it grow. It was just the first night of many, the start of a long, dark season that would swallow up the rest of my girlhood. And it wasn't long before I realized that the horror wasn't just happening to me. It was happening inside of me. My body was keeping a secret of its own, a secret that would soon start to show, and there wasn't a thing in this world I could do to stop it. My body became a traitor. It started telling the secret I was forced to keep quiet. First, it was the sickness in the mornings, a rolling wave in my belly that my mother pretended was just a passing flu. She'd leave a cup of ginger tea for me, her back always turned. Then, my dresses started to feel tight, the seams straining against a truth that was growing bigger every day. In a town like Hollow Creek, you can't hide something like that for long. I learned to walk with my head down, to make myself small, but I could feel the eyes on me everywhere I went. I felt them from Mrs. Gable, our neighbor, whose friendly questions about my health suddenly had a sharp, knowing edge. I saw it in my teacher, Miss Albright, who started looking at me with a sad pity that made me feel more ashamed than any scolding could have. And I heard it in the whispers that would stop the second I turned a corner. They all knew. They looked at my swelling belly, then at the big house where Jedediah Cartwright lived, and they did the simple, ugly math. But Jedediah's name was too heavy, his standing in the town too tall. It was easier for them to whisper about the sinful girl than to speak the name of the man who had brought the sin. So they all just pretended. And I learned that the worst kind of loneliness isn't being by yourself. It's being in a crowd of people who see you're drowning and choose to look away. When the time came, it was a cold, starless night. The pain came like a storm, fierce and wild, and I thought it would surely tear me in two. I was 14. I should have been worrying about school books and whether a certain boy would smile at me. Instead, I was on a sweat-soaked bed, my teeth clamped shut to keep from screaming, because my father was just in the next room, reading his newspaper as if nothing was happening. My mother was the only one with me. She didn't offer a single word of comfort. Her face was a hard, grim mask as she moved around the room, her hands efficient, her eyes empty. She was a midwife to a nightmare. And when it was finally over, when a thin, sharp cry cut through the suffocating silence of the house, she wrapped the baby in an old blanket and placed him in my arms. He was so small, so red and wrinkled, and when I looked at his face, the breath caught in my throat. He had my father's eyes. It was like looking at my tormentor, my monster, but in this tiny, helpless new form. I didn't feel love. I didn't feel anything a mother is supposed to feel. All I felt was a cold, hollow terror. This baby wasn't a gift from God. He was living, breathing proof of the abomination. He was my son, and he was my brother. And I was his mother, and I was his sister. The words didn't make sense. I was just a girl, and I was holding a secret that I would have to feed and clothe and raise. The town, in its own silent way, helped build the lie. A few days later, Pastor Miller came to the house. He was a man whose sermons could shake the sin out of you, they said. He stood over my bed, his Bible in his hand, and he looked at the baby nestled beside me. "A blessing from the Lord," he said, his voice deep and solemn. He prayed for the child's health and for my strength, but the whole time, not once, not for a single second, did he meet my eyes. He looked at the ceiling, at the wall, at the baby, but never at me. It was in that moment that I truly understood. My mother's silence wasn't just hers. It belonged to the whole town. They would all come to the church and praise the Lord, and they would all walk past my house and pretend this baby was a simple blessing, because acknowledging the truth would mean they'd have to acknowledge the monster they all respected. They'd have to dismantle the world they'd built around the good name of Jedediah Cartwright, so they blessed his child and damned me with their silence. I was trapped, not just in that house, but in a story they had all agreed to write for me. I was no longer Eliza. I was now a mother, and as I held that tiny child to my chest, feeling the impossible warmth of his small body, I looked across the room and saw my father standing in the doorway. He wasn't looking at the baby. He was looking at me, and it was the same flat, hungry look from that first night. A cold dread, colder than the sweat on my skin, washed over me. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Life settled into a new kind of quiet, a tense, brittle silence that felt like it could shatter at any moment. The baby, who I named Caleb, became the center of my world, a tiny sun I orbited with a heavy heart. The rhythm of my days was marked by his needs, feeding him, changing him, rocking him to sleep. In those quiet, lonely moments, a strange and painful feeling began to grow in my chest. It wasn't the pure, simple love I read about in books. It was something fiercer, more complicated. It was the fierce love of a protector. I would look down at his perfect, tiny fingers curled around mine, and I would feel a wave of tenderness that scared me. But then he would yawn, or a certain shadow would cross his face, and I would see my father. I would see Jedediah, and the tenderness would curdle into something that felt like fear. Loving Caleb felt like a betrayal of the girl I used to be, and not loving him felt like a sin against the innocent child in my arms. So I was caught in the middle, in a place with no name, just a constant, aching pull in two directions. The encounters were the worst part. We'd all sit at the dinner table, the three of us and the baby in his cradle. The air would be thick with things unsaid. My father would talk about town business, his voice calm and steady, as if we were any other family. He would ask me to pass the salt, and his fingers would brush mine, a touch that felt like a lit match against my skin. My mother would busy herself, her eyes darting everywhere but at me, her movements quick and jerky, like a frightened bird. She'd chatter about the weather, about her garden, about anything at all to fill the terrible silence. She was building a wall of meaningless words to keep the truth out. But the truth was there. It sat at the table with us. Sometimes, when my mother was in the yard, he would walk by my chair and place a hand on my shoulder. He'd say my name, Eliza, his voice low, and it would feel like a chain being dropped around my neck. The fear I had lived with since that first night began to change. It was no longer a memory. It was a premonition. I was a bird with a broken wing, and I could feel the shadow of the hawk circling overhead, getting lower and lower each day. I knew it was only a matter of time before he would swoop down again. One rainy afternoon, looking for an extra blanket in the old cedar chest at the foot of my mother's bed, my fingers brushed against something hard. It was a small wooden box I'd never seen before. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside, nestled in yellowed lace, were things from my mother's girlhood: a ribbon, a few dried flowers, and a tiny Bible, its leather cover worn soft with time. It fell open in my hands, and a small, folded piece of paper fluttered out. It wasn't a letter. It was a drawing done in the simple, unsteady hand of a child. It showed a little house, like ours, with a big, dark, looming shadow of a man standing over a small girl with blonde braids, just like the ones my mother had in old photographs. The girl in the drawing had no mouth. The shadow had no face. It was a picture of pure, silent terror. And in that one devastating moment, I understood everything. My mother, Willa, wasn't just a woman who stood by and watched her daughter's life be destroyed. She was a woman who had already lived it. The silence she had wrapped around me like a shroud wasn't born of indifference. It was born of her own horror, a lesson she had learned so long ago that it had become a part of her. She wasn't just my jailer. She was a fellow prisoner, one who had been locked up so long she'd forgotten what freedom looked like. That night, everything was different. The anger I had held for her, a hard, bitter stone in my heart, dissolved into a terrible, aching pity. Nothing had been excused, but everything was explained. I was watching my father across the table, and he was watching me. The familiar hunger was in his eyes, bold and undisguised. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, the certainty of what was coming. I looked to my mother, a desperate, silent plea. For the first time, she didn't look away. She looked right at me, and her eyes were filled with a bleak, haunted recognition. She wasn't just seeing my fear, she was seeing the ghost of her own. In her silent, broken gaze, she was telling me that this was my path now, the one that had been laid for me, just as it had been for her. I knew then that I was treading on ground that had already been soaked with my family's tears, a dangerous, dark road that had been walked before. And I knew with a certainty that stole the air from my lungs that there was no turning back. The knowing didn't make it any easier. That night, the air in the house was heavy and still, the way it gets before a bad storm. My mother, after seeing that look in my father's eyes and the terror in mine, simply blew out the lamp in the kitchen and went to her room. She didn't say goodnight. She didn't have to. Her retreat was a surrender, a white flag raised over a battle she had no intention of fighting for me. Her closed door was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. I was 15 years old, holding on to the last frayed threads of my girlhood, and she had just left me alone in the dark with the wolf. I sat in the living room, my son Caleb sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby, his little chest rising and falling in a rhythm of innocence I no longer knew. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. When my father finally came for me, there was no pretense, no illusion. His steps were heavy on the floorboards, each one a nail being hammered into the coffin of my life. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The act itself was a language we both understood, a brutal dialect of power and shame. This time, it was different. When I was 12, I had cried. I had been a terrified child, confused and broken. Now, a chilling coldness washed over me. It was as if my spirit just stepped aside. I floated up to the ceiling and watched the whole sordid scene unfold below, a spectator to my own destruction. I saw a scared girl with my face, her body trembling, her eyes wide and empty. I saw a man who was my father, his face a mask of grim determination, reenacting his sin under the roof of the home he was meant to protect. I felt the roughness of the horsehair sofa against my cheek. I smelled the stale whiskey on his breath, but it was all distant, like a dream you're having while you're still half awake. He was breaking my body, but this time he couldn't shatter my mind, because in that cold, floating place, a new thought began to form. It was a tiny, hard thing, like a seed that had been buried in frozen ground and was only now, in the deepest part of winter, beginning to crack open. My mother's story had been erased. Her pain had vanished into the silence. Mine would not. When he was done, he stood up, adjusted his clothes, and walked out of the room as if he'd just stoked the fire. He left me in the dark, a crumpled heap of his making. But the girl he left behind was not the same one he had found. The tears wouldn't come. In their place was a cold, clear resolve that terrified me with its intensity. I lay there for a long time, listening to the house settle, listening to Caleb's soft breathing. Then, I pushed myself up. My movements were slow, deliberate. I went to my room, knelt on the cold wooden floor, and ran my fingers along the edges of the floorboards until I found the one I knew was loose. Using my fingernails, I pried it up. The space underneath was dark and smelled of dust and forgotten time. My heart was pounding, but it was a different rhythm now. Not fear, but a strange, wild purpose. I didn't have anything to put in there. Not yet. So I did the only thing I could think of. I reached for the small scissors my mother kept for her sewing, and with a trembling hand I snipped a tiny lock of my own hair. Then I took a single, loose thread from the hem of Caleb's sleeping gown. I twisted them together, a piece of the violated and a piece of the innocent, and I placed the tiny, tangled knot in the darkness beneath the floor. As I slid the board back into place, a sense of power, faint but real, settled over me. It was a secret that was mine alone. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't hope for escape. It was just a testimony. It was a whisper in the dark that said, I was here. This happened. This was real. He thought he had won, that he had broken me into obedience. But he was wrong. He hadn't just created another victim. He had created a witness. And in that secret space beneath the floor, I had laid the first stone of a memorial that only I would ever see. What I did that night didn't change the bars on my window or the lock on my door, but it changed me. The coldness inside me had been forged into a weapon, a quiet one, a secret one, but a weapon all the same. And I knew with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling that nothing would ever be the same again. Now, I just had to find a way to survive. In the days that followed, a strange calm settled in me. The fear was still there, a constant low hum beneath the floorboards of my soul, but it had a new companion now. Purpose, that tiny hidden knot of hair and thread, was an anchor in the storm of my life. It was a secret kept from them, a rebellion so small and silent they would never even know it existed. I learned to wear my obedience like a cloak, moving through my chores with a quiet efficiency that my mother took for resignation and my father took for defeat. They saw a broken girl, a spirit finally tamed. They had no idea that behind my empty eyes, a witness was being born. I was watching. I was memorizing the scent of his whiskey, the sound of his heavy footsteps, the exact shade of fear in my mother's eyes. I was collecting evidence in the only ledger I had, my own mind. Each day I would add a new line, a new detail, a new crime. My body was a prison, but my memory was becoming a fortress. The new understanding between my mother and me was a fragile, painful thing. We never spoke of the drawing, of course. We never spoke of anything. But something had shifted between us. One afternoon, we sat on the porch shelling peas, the rhythmic snap and pop the only sound between us. I watched her hands, the knuckles swollen with age and work, the skin thin as paper. They were the same hands that had failed to protect me, the same hands that had delivered my son, the same hands that had once, a lifetime ago, drawn a picture of a little girl and a terrifying shadow. For the first time, my anger softened into a vast, aching sorrow. I saw her not as the woman who had betrayed me, but as the girl in the drawing who had never escaped. Her prison was just older than mine, its bars rusted deeper into her soul. She must have felt my gaze, because she looked up, and her eyes met mine for a fleeting second. In that flicker of a glance, I saw it all. A lifetime of shared, unspoken horror. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a terrible, binding recognition. We were two women, trapped on the same dark road, decades apart. It wasn't long before my body betrayed me again. The familiar sickness returned in the mornings, and a heaviness settled deep in my belly. There was no hiding it this time. When I walked into town with my mother to buy flour, the looks we got were different. The pity was gone, replaced by something harder, colder. The whispers weren't just whispers anymore. They were sharp, poisoned darts. I saw Mrs. Gable turn to her friend, her mouth forming a word I couldn't hear, but knew was ugly. The men outside the mercantile would stop talking when I passed, their eyes lingering on my slowly swelling figure with a mixture of contempt and crude curiosity. In their eyes, I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a stain on the town's good name, a girl of loose morals, a fallen woman twice over. And my father, Jedediah Cartwright, remained a pillar of the community, his reputation as spotless as the white paint on the chapel walls. The town's silence was no longer passive. It was an active judgment, and it was aimed squarely at me. The true nature of my prison, however, was revealed one evening when my father had been drinking. He was in a strange mood, not just mean, but expansive, like a king surveying his lands. He looked at me, at my son Caleb playing on the floor, and at my stomach, where his second child was growing. A strange, proud smile touched his lips. "The Cartwright line is a strong one," he slurred, his voice thick with whiskey and self-importance. "It's a clean line, not to be muddied by the weak-blooded folk in these hills. A man has a duty to God to keep his legacy pure." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just lust. It wasn't just sin. It was a belief, a twisted, monstrous doctrine he had built for himself, where his crimes were not crimes at all, but a holy duty. He saw himself as a patriarch, a founder, building a dynasty in his own image, sanctified by his own depraved God. I was not his daughter. I was his broodmare, a vessel for his sacred lineage. That night, as I lay in bed, the child inside me stirring, I finally understood the full, terrifying scope of his madness. I thought I had known hell, but I had only been standing at its gates. He looked at my belly, which was growing with the proof of his sin, and he didn't see a secret to be hidden. He saw a beginning. I suddenly knew this wasn't going to stop. Not at 1, not at 2. He was going to fill this house with his children, my children, until I was nothing but a ghost. I couldn't possibly have imagined what was still to come. The seasons turned, blurring into one another, marked only by the slow, relentless swelling of my belly. My second child was a girl. I named her Sadie. When she was born, in the same silent, sterile terror as her brother, I felt a different kind of ache. Holding a daughter in my arms, a daughter born of this horror, felt like a uniquely cruel twist of the knife. I looked at her soft, innocent face and prayed to a God I no longer believed in that she would never have my eyes, that she would never have to understand the world in the way I did. My father, Jedediah, seemed pleased. He now had a son and a daughter, the perfect start to his perfect, twisted legacy. Life fell into a grim rhythm. I was a mother twice over before my 17th birthday, my world shrinking to the 4 walls of that house, my days a repeating cycle of cooking, cleaning, and caring for 2 children who were also my siblings. The secret stash beneath my floorboards grew. A button that fell from Caleb's first shirt. A single, perfect milk-white feather from the yard. Each object was a silent scream, a piece of my story that I was nailing down, refusing to let it be washed away by the silence. Then, one spring afternoon, a complication arrived on our porch in the form of my old teacher, Miss Albright. She was a kind woman, not from Hollow Creek, with eyes that still held the light of a world beyond our hills. She came with a stack of books, claiming she didn't want my mind to fall fallow. She spoke of poetry, of history, of places where women could be more than just wives and mothers. As she talked, something I thought was long dead flickered inside me. It was a fragile, tender thing, a memory of the girl I was supposed to be, the one who loved to learn, the one who had dreams that went further than the edge of town. For an hour, sitting there on the porch with the smell of lilacs in the air, I felt a sliver of hope. It was a dangerous feeling, I knew, but it was warm. She didn't ask about the children's father. She didn't stare at my rough hands or the shadows under my eyes. She just looked at me, Eliza, and for the first time in years, I felt seen. She promised to come back, to bring more books, to keep that little window to the outside world open for me. That small hope was a foolish luxury. Miss Albright, with her good heart and her city morals, couldn't understand the rules of a place like Hollow Creek. She didn't just want to bring me books. She wanted to save me. A week later, I overheard my father talking to my mother in a low, angry voice. Miss Albright had gone to see the pastor's wife. She had spoken of her concern for me. She had used words like troubling, isolated, and a promising student whose life is being wasted. She thought she was talking to an ally, planting a seed of concern in the heart of the community. But she had no idea what kind of soil she was planting in. The news didn't blossom into help. It spread like a weed, a piece of gossip that the outsider teacher was trying to stir up trouble, that she was casting judgment on the Cartwrights, on the whole town. Instead of rallying to my side, the town closed ranks. They circled their wagons, not around the victim, but around the man they all depended on, the man whose good name was tied to their own. My would-be savior had, with the best of intentions, painted a target on my back. The confrontation was swift and cold. My father waited until my mother and the children were asleep. He found me in the kitchen and backed me against the wall. His rage wasn't hot and loud. It was a chilling, quiet thing that was far more terrifying. He told me that Miss Albright was a meddling fool who would not be welcome in his home again. He told me my schooling, and any thought of it, was over for good. My purpose, he said, was in this house. My duty was to the children. He looked at me then, his eyes like chips of ice, and he said, "You will not bring any more shame or gossip to this family. Your world is here. Do you understand me?" I understood perfectly. He wasn't just punishing me. He was severing my last tie to the outside world. He was making my prison absolute. The window Miss Albright had opened was slammed shut, nailed down, and boarded over. That night, I took out the book of poetry she had left me. Tucked inside was a pressed violet. A small, beautiful thing she'd said reminded her of my eyes. The hope it had represented now felt like a cruel joke. Its beauty was a lie. With numb fingers, I lifted the floorboard and placed the dead flower inside my secret collection. It was not a symbol of hope anymore. It was a tombstone for it. That was the day I learned the deepest, most bitter lesson of all. It wasn't that no one would help me. It was that no one could. Any attempt at rescue from the outside would only make the walls of my prison taller and thicker. The world beyond this porch, beyond these hills, was gone for good. There was only the silence of this house, the shadow of my father, and the grim, certain knowledge that my life would be a long, repeating litany of motherhood. I was going to have to serve my sentence utterly and completely alone. Time passed in the way it does in a prison, measured not by a calendar, but by a tally of sorrows. My third child was born, another boy. Then a fourth. My life became a blur of mouths to feed, bodies to wash, and a deep, soul-crushing weariness. I was a ghost in my own home, a machine of motherhood, my hands raw from lye soap and my heart numb from a pain so constant it had become a part of me, like the beat of my own blood. My father's dynasty was growing. He would sit at the head of the dinner table, surveying his children, my children, with a grotesque patriarchal pride. He was building his legacy on the ruins of my life, and my silent, broken mother stood by and watched it all. My only solace, my only proof that the girl named Eliza still existed, was my secret cache. It was my anchor, my testament, my one tiny act of rebellion in a life of forced submission. It was the only thing in the world that was truly mine. Then, one morning, my father announced that he was going to fix the flooring in the upstairs bedrooms. "Those loose boards are a hazard," he said, looking around at his growing brood of children. "Can't have one of the little ones getting hurt." He said it with the benevolent air of a caring father, a responsible homeowner. But when his eyes met mine, I saw the truth. It was an excuse, an inspection, a way to search the last corners of his kingdom he didn't have complete access to. A cold, sharp terror pierced through the numbness I had cultivated for years, my secrets, my collection. My entire fragile sense of self was hidden right there, under the very board he was talking about fixing. He was going to find it. He was going to unearth my rebellion, expose my one secret, and I would have nothing left. The thought of him holding those pathetic, precious tokens in his big, cruel hands, the lock of hair, the button, the dead flower, made me feel physically ill. That night, I waited until the house was deep in the silence of sleep, until the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the hours until my world would be violated once more. I crept from my bed, the floorboards groaning under my bare feet. Every creak, every sigh of the old house was a thunderclap in my ears. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pry up the board. There they were, my small, sad collection of treasures. My entire life, reduced to a handful of dust and debris. As I gathered them into the pocket of my nightgown, I had to touch each one. The tangled knot of my hair and Caleb's thread, the tiny button from Sadie's gown, the brittle, faded violet from Miss Albright, and as my fingers closed around them, something inside me shifted. The terror that had been choking me for hours began to recede, and in its place, a different feeling rose up, hot and powerful. It was rage, a pure, clean, righteous rage that burned away the fear and the sorrow. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I wasn't just a sad girl collecting mementos of her pain. I was a keeper of evidence. I was the sole witness to a generation of crimes, and these objects were not just my history, they were his indictment. In that moment, I discovered a part of myself I never knew existed, a core of iron forged in the fires of his sins. I had to find a new place, a better place. My mind raced, not in the floor, not in the walls. It had to be somewhere he would never think to look, somewhere he saw as unimportant. My eyes landed on my mother's old sewing box, a place he hadn't looked at in 30 years. With trembling but determined hands, I found a spool of black thread that was almost empty. I carefully unwound the last of it, placed my tiny treasures inside the hollow core of the wooden spool, and then painstakingly wound the thread back on, covering my secret completely. It was perfect, a secret hidden in plain sight, tucked away amongst the mundane tools of female work that he ignored and despised. The next day, I watched with a calm, cold detachment as he hammered nails into the floor of my room, sealing the empty space where my heart used to be. He thought he was finalizing my imprisonment. He had no idea he had just set me free. He had forced me to transform my collection from a memorial into a weapon, and in doing so, he had transformed me. That night, I looked at him as he sat in his chair reading his Bible. I saw him not as a god, not as an all-powerful monster, but for what he was, a wretched, sinful man. A man whose crimes I now held, literally, in the palm of my hand, hidden on a spool of thread. I realized my secret collection wasn't about remembering the past anymore. It was about preparing for the future. It was an arsenal. I didn't know how, and I didn't know when, but I knew with a certainty that settled in my bones that there would be a day of reckoning. And when that day came, I would be ready. The years that followed were a long gray smear. A 5th child was born, and then a 6th. My body was a roadmap of the abuse it had endured, a frail and exhausted vessel that had been filled and emptied 6 times over. I was in my early 20s, but I felt ancient, my bones carrying a weariness that went soul deep. The house was full of the noise of children, but it was a joyless sound, punctuated by the heavy, authoritative presence of my father. He was the sun, and we were all just sad, small planets forced to orbit him. I moved through my days in a fog of duty, my love for my children, a fierce, painful ache in my chest. It was a love born in darkness, a love for these innocent souls who carried the face of my tormentor. My secret on the spool of thread was my only companion, a hard, cold knot of truth in a world of lies. My anger had become a part of me, a low, pilot light of fury that kept me from dissolving completely. I was waiting, but I was starting to fear I wouldn't live to see the day of reckoning I had promised myself. My body was failing, and I was terrified of leaving my children alone with him. That fear, as it turned out, was misplaced. I was worried about the wrong thing. I was so focused on the monster, I knew that I failed to see the one that was growing right in front of me. My eldest, Caleb, was a boy on the cusp of becoming a man. He was his grandfather's favorite. Jedediah took him under his wing, teaching him to hunt, to work the store, to be a man. I thought, with a desperate, foolish hope, that maybe my father's attention on Caleb would keep him away from me, and that maybe, just maybe, Caleb would grow into a better man than his father. He was quiet and smart, and he had my eyes, or so I told myself. My eldest daughter, Sadie, was the opposite. She was quiet like I had been, a watchful, timid girl who seemed to carry a sadness she was too young to understand. She would follow me around the house, a little shadow clinging to my skirts, as if she knew the world was a dangerous place. The moment it happened, the world tilted on its axis. I was in the kitchen, kneading dough, my hands moving with the familiar, mindless rhythm of my life. Caleb and Sadie were in the yard, just outside the window. He had called her over, and he was holding something out to her. It was a small wooden bird, crudely carved, the kind of thing my father used to whittle on the porch. He had taught Caleb how to make them. It should have been a sweet moment, a brother giving his sister a gift, but it was the look on Caleb's face. It was the way he held himself. As Sadie reached for the bird, he caught her wrist. He didn't hurt her, not really, but his grip was firm, a grip of ownership, and the look in his eyes. Dear God, the look in his eyes. It was the same flat, hungry, possessive gleam I had seen in his father's eyes 1,000 times. It was the look of a predator claiming his prey. He leaned in and whispered something to her, and my poor Sadie just lowered her head, her shoulders slumping in a gesture of silent, helpless submission that I knew better than I knew my own name. She looked exactly like I used to. In that one horrific instant, I saw the truth. The poison hadn't died. It hadn't been contained. It had been passed down. My father's sin was not a singular event. It was a seed, a contagion, and he had planted it in my son. Caleb was not just my child. He was his grandfather's apprentice, his successor. The legacy Jedediah was so proud of was not just about creating children. It was about creating more monsters in his own image. The terror that seized me was colder and sharper than anything I had ever felt before. My own suffering, the long years of abuse, the slow death of my soul, it all faded into the background. A new, far more urgent horror took its place. The danger wasn't just to me anymore. It was to my daughter, and the threat was coming from my own son. For years, I had held on to my anger, waiting for some distant day of justice for what had been done to me. But I realized I had been looking in the wrong direction, fighting a battle that was already lost. The fight for my own soul was over. The new war, the only one that mattered now, was the fight for Sadie's. The cycle was not just repeating, it was accelerating, turning in on itself, my children becoming the new players in our family's cursed tragedy. My silence, which I had used as a shield for so long, now felt like a weapon aimed at my own daughter. I had to do something. I had to stop it. But what could a ghost do? What could a woman who didn't even exist outside these four walls do to stop a monster, let alone two? The world, which had been gray and blurry for so long, snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. My one purpose, the only thought that mattered, from the moment I woke to the moment I fell into a fitful sleep, was to keep Caleb away from Sadie. I became a hawk, my eyes constantly tracking, my body always moving to place myself between them. If Caleb entered a room where Sadie was playing, I would find a reason to send her on an errand. If he tried to speak to her in the yard, I would call her in to help me with the laundry. It was a constant, exhausting dance of interception, a silent war fought with chores and gentle commands. Caleb, full of the arrogance his grandfather had taught him, grew frustrated with my interference, his glares becoming more frequent and more hostile. Sadie, my poor, quiet Sadie, seemed to sense the danger without understanding it, clinging to me with a desperation that broke my heart. The air in the house grew thick with a new kind of tension, the quiet hum of a mother's feral protection. I knew this dance couldn't last. A wall of laundry and feigned errands was no defense against the poison that was already in my son's heart. For weeks, I lay awake at night, my mind racing through impossible scenarios. I couldn't run. Where would a woman with 6 children and no money go? I couldn't tell anyone in town. They had already shown me the granite wall of their indifference. My anger, the cold, patient fury I had nurtured for years, was no longer enough. Waiting for a far-off reckoning was a luxury I could no longer afford. The reckoning had to be now. The decision, when it finally formed in my mind, was so terrifying that it left me breathless. I couldn't stop Caleb. Not really. He was just a branch on a poisoned tree. To save my children, to have any hope of breaking this curse, I had to go to the root. I had to confront my father. I had to speak. I would walk up to him, look him in the eye, and I would finally, after a lifetime of silence, tell him the truth of what he had done. I didn't expect it to save me. I didn't know if it would even work. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that the silence had to be broken, and I was the only one who could break it. I spent the next few days gathering my courage, which felt like trying to gather mist in my hands. I rehearsed the words in my head, until they were smooth, hard stones. I would tell him about the first time, when I was 12. I would tell him the names of every child he had forced upon me, and I would tell him that I saw his poison in his grandson, and that I would not stand by and watch it consume another generation. I decided I would do it on a Sunday, after he came home from church, when he was full of the false piety he wore like a cloak. I would face the devil in his Sunday best and show him the wreckage he had made. The fear was a living thing inside me, but for the first time, it was smaller than my resolve. The fight for Sadie's soul had given me a strength I never knew I possessed. But the devil had a plan of his own. The Saturday before I was going to confront him, a terrible crash echoed from the living room. It was followed by my mother's shriek, a sound unlike any I had ever heard from her. I ran in to find my father, Jedediah Cartwright, the unshakable pillar of our town, sprawled on the floor. His face was slack, his mouth twisted, one side of his body utterly still. He had had a massive stroke. The invincible monster who had ruled my life with an iron fist was gone, replaced by a frail, broken old man who couldn't speak, who couldn't move, who could only stare at the ceiling with one good eye full of confusion and terror. The doctor came and went, his words a death sentence. There was no recovery. He would linger, but he was already gone. A wave of emotions crashed over me, so violent they almost brought me to my knees. There was relief, dizzying and immense, that the physical threat was over. But right behind it came a hot, volcanic surge of rage. He was escaping me. After all these years, after I had finally found the courage to face him, he was going to slip away into the fog of death without ever hearing my testimony. He was going to die without being held accountable. I had been robbed of my reckoning. As I stood there, watching my mother weep over the shell of the man who had destroyed us both, a new resolve settled over me, as cold and hard as steel. He wasn't gone yet. His mind might be shattered, but the doctor said he could hear. And that was enough. He would not die in peace. He would not leave this world believing he was a righteous man. The confrontation was still going to happen. But now, it would be on my terms. I would not be a trembling girl begging for him to see his sin. I would be his final judge. I turned and walked to my room, my purpose a straight, clear line through the chaos of the house. I retrieved the spool of black thread from my mother's sewing box. It felt heavy in my hand, heavy with the weight of years, heavy with the lives of my children, heavy with the truth. He wasn't going to escape me. He thought he had written my story, but I would write the final chapter. I walked toward his bedroom, toward the stench of sickness and death, my hand closing around the spool in my pocket. It was time. I was going to watch him die, but first, I was going to make him listen. I pushed open the door to his bedroom, and the smell hit me first. It was the smell of sickness and decay, a sweet, foul odor that clung to the heavy curtains and the stale air. The room was dark, the light of the afternoon sun choked out by the thick drapes he had always insisted on. He was lying in the big four-poster bed, the bed he had shared with my mother, the bed where I was likely conceived. He looked so small in it, a shrunken, pathetic version of the giant who had haunted my entire existence. His face was a pale, slack mask, but his one good eye, the left one, was open. It swiveled and fixed on me as I approached. There was fear in it. Good. That was a start. I walked to the side of the bed and stood over him, the spool of thread a hard, solid weight in my pocket. He was trapped, a prisoner in his own useless body. Just like he had made me. "You can't talk," I began, my voice a low, steady thing I didn't recognize as my own. "But you can hear. And you're going to listen. You are going to listen to every word I have to say." His eye widened, a flicker of panic in its depths. I didn't give him time to process. I started from the beginning. I told him about the girl I was, the 12-year-old who loved dandelions and the smell of rain. I described the Tuesday he came to my room, the scent of his whiskey, the way the light looked hitting the floorboards. I told him how he had murdered that little girl as surely as if he had taken a knife to her. His eye darted back and forth, looking for an escape that wasn't there. "And then came the children," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as ice. My children, your children, my sons and my brothers, my daughters and my sisters, do you remember their names? Or were they just notches on the bedpost of your pride? I listed them. Caleb, I said, and I felt the memory of the button from his first shirt. He was born of terror, and you dared to call him a blessing. Then, Sadie, and I saw the ghost of the dead Violet from Miss Albright's book. She was born of resignation, another soul you chained to this hell. I went on, naming every child, every life that had been forged in his sin. With each name, I took a step closer to the bed, my voice growing stronger, fueled by a lifetime of suppressed rage. He started to make a noise, a guttural, pathetic sound from deep in his throat, the sound of a trapped animal. I leaned in closer, my face just inches from his. But your greatest sin, I whispered, the words like venom on my tongue, was not what you did to me. It was the poison you passed on. I saw it. I saw your evil looking out of Caleb's eyes. I saw him with Sadie. I saw the way he looked at her, the way he touched her. Your legacy. It's safe. The monster you are is now living in my son. I was waiting for the final horror to dawn on his face. I was waiting for shame, for fear, for the shattering of his soul as he realized the true depth of his depravity. But that is not what I saw. As my words sunk in, a flicker of something else appeared in that one good eye. It wasn't terror. It wasn't remorse. It was recognition. It was understanding. And then, as God is my witness, it was pride, a faint, unmistakable gleam of satisfaction. He heard that his evil would live on, and he was pleased. In his last moment of lucid thought, he saw his dynasty secured, his monstrosity made immortal. He had won. That look, that final, triumphant, evil look, was the last thing he ever gave me. As the pride flickered in his eye, his body gave a sudden, violent jerk. A terrible, rattling sound came from his throat, a gasp that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. His body went rigid, and then, just as suddenly, it went slack. The light in his one good eye went out, leaving it a dull, glassy orb staring at nothing. He was gone. He had died, not in shame, but in triumph, his final thought a celebration of his own wickedness. I stood there, my hand still clenched around the spool of thread in my pocket, the words I had prepared still lodged in my throat. He was dead. I had spoken, and it had changed nothing. It had, perhaps, made it worse. My mother's scream from the doorway was a distant sound. The chaos that followed, the weeping, the calls, it was all a muffled roar, like I was underwater. I had confronted the monster, and the monster had died smiling. I was left standing in the ruins of his kingdom, with the ashes of my long-awaited justice turning to dust in my hands. I thought that was the end. I thought that was the bitter, final chapter of our story, where the monster dies unrepentant and the ghost is left to haunt the halls alone. But as the quiet finally fell, long after they had taken his body away, I didn't know that there was one last secret left in that house. One final surprise waiting in the silence. The funeral was a quiet, respectable affair. The whole of Hollow Creek came to pay their respects to the memory of Jedediah Cartwright, the man they thought they knew. They shook my mother's hand, offering condolences with averted eyes, their platitudes like stones in the heavy air. I stood silent through it all, a ghost at my own tormentor's wake. When it was over, the house fell into a quiet it had never known. It was a silence that wasn't born of fear, but of absence. The monster was gone, but his shadow still lingered in every corner. A few days later, my mother and I began the grim task of cleaning out his room, of dismantling the last physical traces of his reign. It was a silent chore. Two women moving through a museum of pain, folding clothes that still held his scent, boxing up papers that held the details of a life built on a lie. It was in the back of his closet, tucked under a loose floorboard I never knew existed, that I found it. A small tin box, heavy and locked. We pried it open, expecting to find old coins or property deeds. But it was full of letters, dozens of them, tied in faded ribbon. They were addressed to a Martha, and the handwriting was my mother's. Martha was her sister, who had moved west and died of a fever before I was even born. My mother had never spoken of her. With trembling hands, I began to read. And the last secrets of that house rose up from the yellowed pages. It was all there, a hidden history of my mother's life. She wrote of her own father, a man whose shadow was as dark as Jedediah's. She wrote of trying to run away when she was 16, only to be caught and brought back in shame. And she wrote of Jedediah, a man chosen for her, a marriage to cover the sin that had been visited upon her by her own father. The most chilling letters were from the years after I was born. She wrote of her horror, watching history repeat itself, watching the man she was forced to call her husband turn his hungry eyes on her own daughter. She wrote of her powerlessness, her brokenness, her shame. She hadn't been a silent accomplice. She had been a veteran of the same war, too wounded to fight another battle. But the last letter, dated just a few months before my father's death, held the final, most shocking truth. "I see it in the boy now," she wrote to her dead sister, her confidant in the grave. "I see Jedediah's poison in Caleb's eyes when he looks at little Sadie. The cycle is turning again, and I am an old woman, and I will not watch another generation be devoured. I have been giving him the foxglove, just a little, every day, in his coffee. The old folks say it weakens the heart over time. I am a coward, Martha, but I will not let him do to her what was done to us. I will stop him. It is the only thing I have left to give." I looked up from the letter, the world spinning, the stroke. It wasn't fate. It wasn't an act of a just God. It was my mother. My quiet, beaten, silent mother had been the one. She had been secretly, patiently, and methodically killing him. All my waiting, all my collecting of evidence, all my plans for a final reckoning. I had been waiting for a battle she had already been fighting, in her own quiet, desperate way. I walked into the kitchen, the letters in my hand. She was standing at the sink, her back to me, and for the first time I saw not a frail, broken woman, but a soldier. I laid the letters on the table. She turned, saw them, and her face, a lifetime of secrets held in its lines, finally crumpled, and we talked. For the first time, we truly talked. We cried for the girls we had been, for the women we were forced to become, and for the terrible silent choices we'd had to make. In the days that followed, something in the house settled for good. The fear was gone. Armed with the truth, and with my mother no longer a ghost, but an ally, I faced Caleb. I told him I knew what I had seen, and that the age of monsters in our house was over. The power, stripped from its source, withered in him. He was just a boy after all, a boy taught to be cruel, and without his teacher, he was lost. The house, once my prison, slowly started to feel like a home. It was still filled with ghosts, but now they were our ghosts, and we were not afraid of them. I learned that courage is not always a roar. Sometimes it is a whisper in a letter to a dead sister. Sometimes it is a woman quietly grinding a flour into a monster's coffee. Sometimes it is just choosing to survive, one day at a time, until you have a chance to live. We survived, and now we would live. This is how I found my way out of the darkness. This is my story. If it moved you, if it made you feel anything at all, share it with someone. There are so many silences in the world, so many stories that need to be heard. Your voice matters. My mother and I are still here, in this old house in Hollow Creek, and I want to know what you think. Tell me, what city are you watching this from? I'd love to know how far my words have traveled.